Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Good morning and welcome back. So, we were discussing strategic entry deterrence, and in our previous model we had looked at the incumbent investing in excess capacity to deter entry. It was in the context of full information, right. So, wherein the entrant could see what was the capacity K1 bar which the incumbent had installed, and then the entrant took a decision of whether to enter or not. And in that model we had introduced some key ideas, which was one was blockaded entry, where the fixed costs are so high that the entrant is not able to enter. The second case was accommodated entry, which is that the fixed cost is substantially low and it is more profitable for the incumbent to play the Stackelberg leader and accommodate the entrant as opposed to deterring entry. And the third one was deterred entry, where the incumbent invested in excess capacity, which is capacity more than what it would have invested at had it just been a Stackelberg leader, and by this it is able to deter entry. In today's module we are going to introduce asymmetric information, and we are going to understand entry deterrence in the context of entry deterrence. We are going to look at two models. In the first one, we will the information asymmetry will be about the marginal cost of the entrant. In the second model, the information asymmetry will be about the marginal cost of the incumbent. So, let us start with the first model, which is going to discuss the information asymmetry about the entrance cost, and we will call it as long-term contracts as a barrier to entry. So, to motivate this, consider the antitrust case against Microsoft in the 2000s, where one of the complaints was that so there were two issues. One was Microsoft had bundled its operating system and Internet Explorer and was keeping out its rivals, mainly Netscape. The other complaint or concern was that Microsoft had signed long-term contracts with the PC owners to have its operating system installed in those PCs in order to keep the rivals out of the market. Okay. So, in this context, consider the following model. So, let us consider a good which extends over two periods. In the first period, only the incumbent is going to be there. So, at t equal to 1, the incumbent is the only firm who is going to be there, and this incumbent faces the threat of entry from a potential entrant who is likely to enter at t equal to 2. So, at t equal to 2, a potential entrant is likely to enter. Now, let us to simplify the model, let us assume that the incumbent's marginal cost. So, the incumbent's marginal cost is, let us say, rupees 50 per unit, right. In each period, the buyer is interested in buying 1 unit of the product, right. So, let us also put that structure. In each period, the buyer buys 1 unit, and the willingness to pay of the buyer for the good is, let us say, rupees 100, right. So, the incumbent's marginal cost of production is 50. There are these two periods. The incumbent is the only firm at t equal to 1. At t equal to 2, there is an entrant who is likely to enter, and in each period the consumers are interested in buying exactly 1 unit of the product, and the willingness to pay for the good, for each unit of the good, for the consumer is rupees 100. Now, the incumbent's marginal cost is full information. What is not fully known is the marginal cost of the entrant, right. So, the entrant's marginal cost, right. So, neither the buyer nor the incumbent knows the marginal cost of the entrant, right. So, the entrant's marginal cost is private information, right. So, neither the buyer nor the incumbent knows the marginal cost of the entrant. However, what they do know is that the entrant's marginal cost, right. So, however, they know that the entrant's marginal cost is uniformly distributed between in the interval between 0 and 100, right. So, this is known by not just the buyer, it is also known by the incumbent. Now, this is a sequential move game where the incumbent chooses the price at t equal to 1, then and the incumbent can possibly sign a contract with the buyer, and we are interested in knowing what kind of contract would the incumbent write with the buyer, so as to keep out the entrant from entering at t equal to 2. But more importantly, the entrant's marginal cost is private information. All that the buyers and the incumbent know is that the marginal cost of the entrant, let us say CE or C, is uniformly distributed in the interval between 0 and 100. Okay. So, as with any of these sequential games, we will solve the model backwards starting with t equal to 2. So, we solve the model starting from t equal to 2. So, at t equal to 2, the competition between the incumbent and the entrant is in terms of prices. So, the post entry competition is birth round, right. So, the incumbent and the entrant choose the prices. Now, think about this as follows: the incumbent's marginal cost is 50 rupees per unit. If the entrant's marginal cost was greater than 50, right. So, let us say C was greater than 50, then this price competition will drive the entrant out of the market, right. So, the entrant will not be able to survive, right. So, for example, if the think of the entrant's marginal cost is, let us say 60 rupees per unit, then all that the incumbent has to do is to choose a price which is less than 60, let us say 59 if the lowest denomination was 1 rupee, and then the entrant would not be able to compete with the incumbent. So, if the marginal cost of the entrant, let us call it C, is greater than 50, then E cannot compete with the incumbent, right. So, the marginal cost of the incumbent is 50. So, if the entrant's marginal cost was greater than 50, let us say even 51, even then the entrant will not be able to compete with the incumbent, because price competition will bring down the price to 50, at which case the entrant will not be able to survive the competition. So, now let us ask, what is the probability that C is greater than 50? So, why are we interested in this? Because this essentially tells us that with probability C greater than 50, the entrant is not going to enter the market. The reason the entrant will not enter the market is because in such a case the entrant knows that it will not be able to compete with the incumbent. So, it is better off not entering the market at all. So, probability C greater than 50 is essentially 1 minus the probability that C is less than equal to 50, and because C is uniformly distributed in 0 to 100, this is essentially 1 minus 1/2, which is equal to 1/2. So, with probability, so with P equals 1/2, there is no entry, which means the incumbent essentially is a monopolist. With the other probability 1/2, there will be entry, and there will be entry, and this corresponds to the case where the marginal cost of the entrant is less than equal to 50, right. So, imagine that the marginal cost of the entrant is, let us say, 40 rupees per unit. If the marginal cost of the entrant was 40, then price competition would imply that the entrant would choose a price which is exactly equal to 50, and let us to simplify matters, let us assume that if both the incumbent and the entrant charge the same price, the consumers are going to go to the entrant. So, given that the incumbent's marginal cost is 50, the entrant could go up to a price of 50 even if its marginal cost was less than 50, and essentially capture the entire market demand, right. So, in such a case, price competition will drive the price to 50, at which point the incumbent would drop out, right. So, the incumbent will drop out. So, with probability C greater than probability 1/2, wherein the marginal cost of the entrant is greater than 50, the entrant is not going to survive competition. So, there is only going to be the incumbent. With probability C less than equal to 50, which is 1/2, the entrant is going to enter, charge a price of 50, and the incumbent is going to drop out. So, this means that the expected price paid by the buyer is as follows. Now, with probability 1/2, there is not going to be any entry. Well, if there is not going to be any entry, the incumbent is going to be the monopolist in this market. The incumbent is going to charge a price of 100, right. So, this is the case where there is no entry, and with the other probability of 1/2, the entrant will enter, charge a price of 50, the incumbent will drop out, and the buyer will end up paying 50. So, essentially this means 50 plus 25. So, this is rupees 75. So, the expected price paid by the buyer to buy 1 unit of the product is going to be rupees 75. Given that the willingness to pay, so let us say, given that the willingness to pay of the buyer is rupees 100, this means that the expected surplus to the buyer is essentially rupees 100 minus 75, which is rupees 25, right. So, the willingness to pay of the buyer is 100, the expected price that the buyer is going to pay is going to be rupees 75, which means that the expected surplus is going to be 100 minus 75, which is going to be equal to rupees 25. So, any contract that the incumbent signs with the entrant must guarantee the buyer signs with the buyer, excuse me. So, any contract that the incumbent signs with the buyer must guarantee the buyer a surplus of at least rupees 25. Anything less than that, the buyer is not interested in signing that contract. So, the question that we are going to ask is, right. So, there are a question that we are going to ask is, can the incumbent offer such a contract? That guarantees the buyer a surplus of at least rupees 25. The other question that we will ask is, will the buyer sign such a contract? Will the buyer sign such a contract? And the third thing that we will ask is, what are the welfare implications of such a contract? What are the welfare implications of such a contract? Before we answer these questions, let us first talk about what is the kind of contract that the incumbent can offer the buyer. So, the contract is as follows. So, the contract is as follows. So, in the first period, the buyer promises to buy the good from the incumbent at t equal to 2, right. So, in the first period the buyer promises to buy the good from the incumbent in the second period, right, at a price which is equal to rupees 75. So, if I am the incumbent, I sign a contract with the buyer, wherein in the contract it is written that the buyer will buy the good from the incumbent and will pay a price which is equal to rupees 75, with one exception. The exception is that the buyer can buy the good from the entrant at t equal to 2, right. So, ideally we would the contract says that the buyer is going to be guaranteed the good from the incumbent at a price of 75. However, if the buyer chooses to buy the good from the entrant at t equal to 2, then the exception is that the buyer can buy the good from E at t equal to 2 by paying a rupees 50 breach of contract fee to the incumbent, right. So, this is very important, right. So, it tells us that the contract is such that the buyer will buy the product from the incumbent at rupees 75 at t equal to 2. However, if the buyer chooses to buy the good from the incumbent at from the entrant at t equal to 2, the buyer is free to do so, provided it pays a breach of contract fee, a penalty to the incumbent, which is equal to rupees 50. Okay, so let us keep that in mind. Now, so let us understand some of the features of this contract. So, what are some of the features of this contract? Okay. So, the first thing that we will notice is that without the contract, an entrant with marginal cost less than or equal to 50 was able to enter. The contract will now allow only entrants with a marginal cost less than or equal to 25 to enter. Let us first write it and then we will see. The entrant will only enter if C is less than or equal to 25, right. So, the entrant will only enter if C is less than or equal to 25. The reason is the entrant will only enter if C is less than or equal to 25. So, the reason is that in the second period, the buyer can either buy from the incumbent at rupees 75, because that is what the contract says, right. That is what the contract says, because I am guaranteed to buy the good from the incumbent at rupees 75, or buy from the entrant at a price which is, let us say, PE, which is charged by the entrant, but then it has to pay the 50 rupees breach of contract fee, right. So, the 50 rupees breach of contract fee it needs to pay. So, either I buy from the incumbent by paying 75, or I buy from the entrant at a price PE plus 50. Now, notice that the buyer will buy from the incumbent or buy from the entrant rather, will buy from the entrant only when PE plus 50 is less than equal to 75. Otherwise, the buyer is not interested in buying the contract from the buying the good from the entrant, right, because I am guaranteed to get the same good at a much lower price of 75 from the incumbent. This essentially means that the price charged by the entrant must be less than equal to 25. What does this mean? The entrant's marginal cost is uniformly distributed between 0 to 100. The maximum price that the entrant can charge when a contract is present between the incumbent and the buyer is rupees 25. This essentially means, so this is 50, so this is 20. This essentially means that only the entrant with marginal cost less than equal to 25 can profitably enter and compete with the incumbent. So, the only way an entrant can do this, can sell at PE which is equal to 25 is if its marginal cost is less than equal to 25, right. So, the incumbent's marginal cost was 50. In the absence of any contract, only buyers between 0 and 50 with only an entrant with marginal cost between 0 and 50 was able to enter. Once the contract is introduced, it immediately lowers the probability of entry for the entrant from 1/2 to 1/4. Thus, the contract restricts entry, right. Why does it restrict entry? Because previously all C less than equal to 50 could have entered, an entrant with a marginal cost C less than equal to 50 could have entered, the probability of that is 1/2. Now, an entrant with C less than equal to 25 only can enter, the probability of C less than equal to 25 is 1/4. So, the probability that C less than equal to 25 is essentially 25 minus 0 by 100 minus 0, which is 1/4 is the probability of entry, which is reduced, right. So, this is why the long term contract between the incumbent and the buyer can be anti-competitive, right, in the sense that it immediately restricts the probability of entry from 1/2 to 1/4. Okay. So, that is the first observation. Now, let us ask, will the buyer sign the contract? Will the buyer sign the contract? Now, the buyer will sign the contract. Recall, in the absence of a contract, the buyer is guaranteed an expected surplus of rupees 25, right. So, the buyers, so without the contract, expected surplus to the buyer is rupees 25, right. So, we computed that earlier, right. So, the expected price paid by the buyer is 75. So, the expected surplus is 25, we computed that. So, with a contract, the buyer should get a surplus at least as large as 25. So, we need to check whether this contract is going to give the buyer a surplus of at least this much. Now, the contract is such that no matter what the buyer will pay rupees 75. Why is that so? Now, notice that the probability of entry is 1/4. So, the probability that the entrant will not enter is 3/4. How do we know that? So, probability of entry is 1/4. So, with probability 1 minus 1/4, which is 3/4. So, with P equal to 3/4, the buyer will buy from the incumbent and pay rupees 75, because that is what the contract says. With probability 1/4, right. So, just to not confuse, let us just write it as with probability 3/4 and with probability 1/4, the buyer will buy from the entrant at rupees 25, right. So, the buyer will pay the entrant 25, but then will pay rupees 50 as the penalty, right, because if I am breaching the contract I need to pay 50 rupees to the incumbent. So, the expected price paid by the buyer is essentially with probability 3/4 I pay 75, with probability 1/4 I pay the entrant 25, but then I need to pay the 50 rupee breach of contract penalty, which essentially means that I pay 75 rupees. The expected price paid by the buyer with the contract is again rupees 75, which means the expected surplus is rupees 100 minus 75, which is again rupees 25, right. So, the expected surplus for the buyer does not change, right. So, the buyer is not worse off, right. So, buyer is not worse off with the contract. The buyer is also not better off, but he is certainly not worse off. Okay. So, we could say that if since the buyer is not worse off, the buyer would be interested to sign the contract. Buyer is interested in signing the contract. Right. So, the buyer is interested in signing the contract. So, the thing that we will now need to check is will the or rather so we listed down these questions. So, can the incumbent offer such a, will the buyer offer such a contract? We have actually addressed it. Now, let us ask, will the incumbent want to offer such a contract, right. So, will I offer the contract? Now, to answer this we need to ask what is the incumbent's profit in the absence of the contract, what is the incumbent's profit with the contract, and does the contract give the incumbent a larger profit compared to the case of no contract. If yes, then the incumbent would like to offer the contract. Okay. So, need to compare the profit of the incumbent without and with the contract. So, we need to make this comparison. Okay. Let us start with the case where the contract is not there. So, without the contract, what is the incumbent's profit? Well, without the contract the probability of entry is 1/2. So, with probability 1/2 the entrant will enter and the incumbent will not offer the product to the buyer. With the other probability 1/2 the incumbent will enter and be a monopolist and charge 100. So, I will sell at rupees 100 with probability 1/2. So, because with the other probability 1/2 the entrant is going to enter, which implies that I's expected profit is 1/2 times 100, because with the other probability 1/2 the entrant will not enter. So, the incumbent will be the monopolist and will charge the monopoly price, which is equal to the maximum willingness to pay of 100. So, 50 is my marginal cost. So, the incumbent's expected profit is rupees 25. With the contract, what happens? So, with the contract the with probability 1/4 or rather with probability 1/4 the entrant will enter. So, with probability 3/4 entrant will not enter. So, I will sell to the buyer at a price of rupees 75. With the probability 1/4 I will get the breach of contract penalty, which is rupees 50, or rather which is rupees 50, which essentially means that I's expected profit is 3/4 times 75 minus my marginal cost, which is 50, right. So, with probability 3/4 I will charge a price 75 because that is what the contract says, and my marginal cost is 50, plus with the other probability 1/4 I will not offer the product because it is the entrant who is going to sell the product to the buyer at a price of 25, but the buyer will pay me 50 rupees as the breach of contract penalty. So, this is 25 times 3, that is 75 over 4 plus 50 over 3. So, that is 125 over 4, which is rupees 31.25, which is greater than the rupees 25 that existed without the contract, which means I will offer the contract, and we have already seen that the buyer will sign it, right. So, I will offer the contract, and we have already seen here that the buyer is interested in signing the contract. So, the contract is offered, the buyer and the incumbent sign the contract, the buyer is no worse off, the incumbent is strictly better off, and this contract is actually going to restrict entry, right. So, the third thing that we want to ask is, how does this impact welfare? So, from a social point of view, this contract is inefficient, right. So, even though it benefits the buyer, even though it benefits the incumbent and does not hurt the buyer, from a social point of view this contract is inefficient. Let us see why. Well, we know that the contract increases the surplus to the buyer and the incumbent from, so what was the surplus to the buyer and the incumbent without the contract? So, without the contract the buyer was getting an expected surplus of 25, and the expected profit to the incumbent was again 25, because with probability 1/2 he would sell, he would charge a price of 100, his marginal cost would be 50. So, it is 1/2 times 100 minus 50. So, that would again be 25. So, it increases the surplus to the buyer and the incumbent from 50 to, now the buyer gets the same expected surplus, the buyer is no worse off, but we just saw that the incumbent's profit increased to 31.25. So, this is 56.25, right. So, the contract has increased the surplus from 50 to 56.25. However, it reduces the entrant's expected surplus by more than rupees 6.25, right. So, the loss to the entrant is greater than the gain to the buyer and the incumbent. So, on a larger scale of things the contract is actually going to be inefficient. So, let us ask why this is so. So, to answer this question, think of the following. So again this was the entrance marginal cost, which is uniformly distributed in this interval. Prior to the contract C less than equal to 50, the entrant having marginal cost less than equal to 50 was entering the market. So, without the contract entrant with a marginal cost less than equal to 50 was entering and charging rupees 50, right. So, it is entrants in this interval which were entrant in this interval was entering and charging 50. So, if I take a simple expected marginal cost of the entrant to be, let us say, somewhere here, right. So, the expected cost of the entrant is simply the average of average in this interval, which is 25. So, the profit of the expected profit to the entrant essentially is that the probability of entry is 1/2, he charges 50, and on an average the cost of the entrant would be 25. So, this is going to be rupees 12.5. Now, with the contract, what happens with the contract? It reduces the probability. So, this is without the contract. With the contract, it reduces the probability of entry, and only entrant with a marginal cost less than equal to 25 can enter. So, with the contract, only entrant with C less than equal to 25 can enter. So, the entrant will charge a price which is equal to rupees 25, right, and in this interval we would expect that the average cost of the entrant is going to be about 12.5, right. So, the entrant's average cost or the expected cost would be rupees 12.5, which means the expected profit of the entrant is now. So, now the probability of entry is only 1/4, the entrant charges 25, has an expected cost of 12.5, and this turns out to be rupees 3.125, right. So, with the contract the entrant's expected profit is 3.125, without the contract the entrant's expected profit was 12.5. So, essentially the contract has reduced the profit of the entrant by rupees 12.5 minus 3.125, which is rupees 9.375, and this loss is greater than the gain to the buyer and the incumbent, right. So, what the incumbent loses is more than the gain to the buyer and the incumbent, which essentially means that the contract is inefficient, right. So, the contract is inefficient. So, this is a big lesson that comes out, right. So, even though and the contract is anti-competitive because it restricts entry, but more importantly the loss to the entrant is more than the gain to the buyer and the incumbent. So, the contract is inefficient, and the inefficiency arises because the contract restricts entry, right. So, it reduces the probability of entry from 1/2 to 1/4. So, only an entrant with marginal cost between 0 and 25 can enter. So, an entrant with a marginal cost between 25 and 50 cannot enter now, even though such an entrant has a lower marginal cost than the incumbent. Yet such an entrant cannot enter because of the contract which is written between the incumbent and the entrant, right. So, an entrant with marginal cost was more efficient than the incumbent because the incumbent's marginal cost is 50, yet because of the contract such an entrant cannot enter, right. So, such an entrant cannot enter. Thus, while I can restrict entry, so can the contract be used as a mechanism to restrict entry? The answer is yes. However, it is inefficient. While the incumbent can restrict entry, the contract is inefficient. Right. So, that is one of the main lessons that comes out from this particular example. Right. So, the key aspect is that while I have this entire stretch between 0 and 100, the incumbent's marginal cost is 50, right. So, previously these were the marginal cost ranges over which the entrant would occur. So, entry without the contract. After the contract is signed, only entrants between 0 and 25, right, can enter. So, in particular there is this zone of entrants who are more efficient than the incumbent, still they cannot enter. So, these are entrant who is more efficient than the incumbent, still cannot enter. Okay. So, this is the main takeaway of this model. So, two things. One is, can a contract be written between an incumbent and the buyer which will restrict entry? The answer is yes, because we have seen that a contract which guarantees the buyer a second period price of ₹75 if the buyer buys from the incumbent, but also introduces a breach of contract fee which is ₹50, can lock in the buyer with the incumbent, and more importantly it restricts the probability of entry, because only entrants with a marginal cost between 0 and 25 can now enter. But the other main message conveyed by the model is that while entry restriction is possible, such a contract is inefficient. Okay. Now, let us move to a second model where the information asymmetry is regarding the incumbent's cost. Okay. So, let us call this as limit pricing to deter entry. In the previous model, the information asymmetry was regarding the entrant's marginal cost. The buyer and the incumbent did not know the marginal cost of the entrant, and C was uniformly distributed between 0 and 100. In this model, it is the entrant who will not know the marginal cost of the incumbent. Okay. So, let us model this game. So, consider a two period game. Consider a two period game where there is an incumbent and a potential entrant. E. Now, at t equal to 1, which is the first period, there is no entrant. So, essentially the incumbent is a monopolist. So, in the first period, there is no entry. So, the incumbent is a monopolist and charges the monopoly price. So, based on the price, so the entrant observes the price set by the incumbent, right. So, the entrant observes the price set by the incumbent and then decides to enter or stay out, right. So, at the end, in the first period there is no entry, the incumbent is the monopolist, chooses the price, the entrant observes the price set by the incumbent and then decides whether to enter or not enter. If it decides to stay out, then at t equal to 2, again the incumbent remains a monopolist, and if the entrant decides to enter at t equal to 2, there is going to be the entrant also chooses a price, and there is and both the firms get profits. We will put structure to that in a moment. Right. So, the information part of this game is as follows. So, I knows its marginal cost. So, the incumbent knows its marginal cost, the marginal cost of the entrant, and the market demand, in each period. Right. So, as far as the incumbent is concerned, the incumbent knows what its marginal cost is, what the entrant's marginal cost is, and also what is the market demand at t equal to 1 and at t equal to 2. As far as the entrant is concerned, the entrant only knows its marginal cost. He knows its marginal cost, but does not know the marginal cost of the incumbent. So, all it does is it believes, so it forms a belief that with some probability the incumbent either is a low cost firm or the incumbent is a high cost firm, right. So, it forms a belief. So, he forms a belief that with probability, let us call it theta, I is a low cost firm, and with probability 1 minus theta, I is a high cost firm. Right. So, with probability theta it is a low cost firm, and with probability 1 minus theta the incumbent is a high cost firm. Okay. Now, to make the model tractable, we will work out a particular example, right. So, let us say that, so in the first period, when I has low costs, right. So, when the incumbent has low costs and sets the monopoly price, so in the first period there is no entrant. So, the incumbent essentially is the monopolist. So, it has low cost and sets the monopoly price corresponding to that low cost firm. It earns a profit of, let us say, rupees 100 million. On the other hand, if I has high cost and sets the monopoly price corresponding to the high cost firm, it earns a profit of, let us say, rupees 60 million, right. So, if I am low cost and I set the price that a low cost monopolist would charge, the profit that the incumbent would get would be rupees 100 million. If I am a high cost firm and I know my cost and I set a price which is equal to the price that a high cost monopolist would have set, my profit would have been equal to 60 million. On the other hand, if I was a high cost firm, but chooses the price that is optimal for a low cost firm, chooses a price that is optimal for a low cost firm, its profit is rupees, let us say, 40 million, right. So, ideally it would like to set a high price and get 60 million as its profit, but now its profit, because it is going to choose a price which is set by the low cost firm, there is some amount of inefficiency and it earns a profit which is equal to 40. This is when there is no entry, right. So, because there is no entrant in the first period. At t equal to 2, so this is at t equal to 1. So, in the second period, the entrant may or may not enter. So, if there is no entry, so the profit of I depends on whether E enters or not, right. So, the profit will depend on whether the entrant would like to enter or not want to enter, right. So, if there is no entry, then I essentially is a monopolist. So, I is a monopolist at t equal to 2, and if it is a low cost monopolist, it will earn 100 million, and if it is a high cost firm, it will earn rupees 60 million, just as we had here, right. So, if it is a low cost firm, I will earn 100 million, if it is a high cost firm, I will earn 60 million. Okay. If there is entry, right, then there is going to be competition between the entrant and the incumbent. So, if it is a low cost firm, it earns rupees 50 million, whereas the entrant earns a profit of minus rupees 20 million, whereas if the incumbent is a high cost firm, it earns a profit of 20 million, whereas the entrant also earns a profit of 20 million, right. So, this essentially tells us that now the high cost has some interest in pretending to be of a low cost firm. The reason being that if the high cost can somehow signal to the entrant that it is a low cost firm, it may be possible that the entrant decides not to enter, and that may be profitable for the incumbent, right. So, let us first capture all of this in the form of a game tree, and then we will analyze the model. So, E's uncertainty, so the entrant's uncertainty about I's marginal cost is captured by introducing the player nature who moves first, right. So, who moves first? Who moves first and chooses the cost of the incumbent firm. Okay. So, let us draw this. So, we have nature which moves first, and nature chooses the type of the firm. So, with probability 1 minus theta, it is a high cost firm, with probability theta, it is a low cost firm, right. So, at this node essentially it is I L, right. So, and at this node is essentially I H. Well, the high cost firm can either choose a high price or a low price, can choose either a high price or can choose a low price. The low cost firm essentially can also choose a low price or a high price, but as will be clear later, the low cost incumbent has no incentive to charge a high price. So, we will just say the low cost firm charges a low price, right. So, let us draw this more accurately. Right. And after this, the incumbent, or rather, so the incumbent can either charge a low price or a high price. So, we are not choosing to draw this branch tree where the low cost incumbent is going to charge a high price, we will not draw that. So, now essentially the high cost incumbent might want to choose a low price, right. So, might want to choose a low price. Why would it want to choose a low price? Because the incumbent believes that E may reason as follows, right. E may reason as follows: if I charges a high price, then it is an inefficient firm. So, E should enter, whereas if the incumbent charges a low price, right, then the entrant believes that it is a low cost firm, then it is an efficient firm, so E should not enter, right. So, E should not enter. So, this is why the high cost firm may have an incentive to pretend to be of a low cost firm. So, let us think about what this is going to look like. So, the entrant moves here, right. Because of the asymmetric information, the entrant does not know what the true type of the incumbent is going to be, and the entrant can either choose to enter or not enter. Here also the entrant can choose to enter or not enter, and again can choose to enter or not enter, right. So, now let us look at the payoffs. So, for the incumbent, the payoffs are, well, if it is a high cost firm and the entrant enters, then in the first period it is going to get the monopoly profits of 20, in the second period it gets 20 for a total of 80 million, whereas the entrant is only going to get 20 million. If it stays out, the incumbent essentially is a monopolist in both the periods, so it gets 120, the entrant essentially is going to get 0, right. If it is going to pretend to be a low cost firm and the entrant enters, then notice as per our structure, the incumbent's profit is going to be 40 in the first period, it earns and in the second period it earns 20 as before. So, that is 20, and the entrant is going to earn 20, whereas if it stays out, the incumbent's profit is 40 plus 60, which is 100, and the entrant's profit is going to be equal to 0. And on the other hand, if the incumbent is a low cost firm and there is entry, then in the first period it essentially charges the monopoly price, gets the duopoly profit of 50. So, for a total of 150, the entrant essentially gets minus 20, and finally, if the entrant decides not to enter, it gets 0, whereas the incumbent gets 100 plus 100, which is equal to 200. So, now you would notice that there is a strong incentive for the incumbent to pretend to be of low type. Why is that? Because if the entrant were to set a high price and the entrant enters, it gets 60 in the first period, whereas in the second period the duopoly will lead it to 20 for a total of 80. Whereas on the other hand, if it chooses a low price, then the entrant believes that I am competing with a high cost with a more efficient firm. So, I give up something in the first period, but I get a higher monopoly profit by keeping the entrant out. So, my profit is going to be 100. So, this is larger than the 80 that I would get. So, the incumbent has a strong incentive to pretend to be of a low type. So, what beliefs would sustain this? Well, what beliefs are reasonable? What beliefs are reasonable? Well, for the entrant, the expected profit by entering, is going to be 20 and it is going to be minus 20, depending on whether on what its belief is about the type of the incumbent. So, with probability theta, the entrant would know that it is competing with a low cost incumbent. So, if it enters, it gets a profit of negative 20, whereas with probability 1 minus theta, it will compete with a high cost firm, and if it enters, it will get the duopoly profit of 20. So, this turns out to be equal to 20 minus 40 theta. So, if 20 minus 40 theta is greater than 0, right, if 20 minus 40 theta is greater than 0, which is its profit by staying out, which essentially means that 20 is greater than 40, so theta is less than half. So, if the entrant believes that theta is less than half, so it will enter, which implies that as far as the incumbent is concerned, if the probability of being if the probability of being low cost is theta greater than 1/2, it will be better off, pretending to be a low cost firm and set a low price and deter entry, right. So, by forming this belief, the incumbent will be able to keep the entrant out. Thank you.